Welcome to the session on breakthroughs in brain disease. My name is John Hamilton. I'm a science correspondent for National Public Radio. For the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to be talking with three scientists who are pursuing really innovative ways of treating brain diseases and disorders. These include Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, addiction, depression, schizophrenia. So let me introduce the speakers very briefly, not just by their academic titles, but by the sort of research they do, in no particular order here. But Roberta Diaz-Brinton is studying why women are more likely than men to develop Alzheimer's. She's also experimenting with ways to get the brain to regenerate after it has been damaged, something medical textbooks used to say was impossible. Robbie is a professor at the University of Arizona and leads the Center for Innovation in Brain Science there. Oh, and she is a huge opponent of scientific dogma. Ahweed Zarasa wants to figure out how to rewire the brain to treat mental illnesses like depression and schizophrenia. He's also pushed for genetic studies that look beyond European genes and even studied dog emotions. Kaf is an MD PhD at Duke University. He's an investigator for the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. He is also the only scientist I know who has responded to an academic critic with a Kendrick Lamar diss track. Ali Rezai thinks a technology called focused ultrasound could change treatment of brain diseases like Alzheimer's and even help with disorders like gambling. He's a brain surgeon who has worked on everything from brain-computer interfaces to deep brain stimulation. And apparently in his spare time, Ali is the executive chair of the Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute at West Virginia University. So I thought it might be useful to have each of the speakers say just a few words about their work. Let's do that in reverse order. So, Ali, tell us about focused ultrasound.
So, focused ultrasound, we all know it's a part of our daily lives. It's transformed the diagnostics, looking at a baby in a womb or looking at your echo with the heart. It's also being used, ultrasound, for therapy, from cleaning your teeth to looking at kidney stones, treating them, and chronic pain. But the innovation has occurred really in the past 10 years where engineers and computer science and scientists have come together to be able to focus the ultrasound beams and to deliver it non-invasively in an outpatient fashion through the brain, going through your skull and getting deep inside your brain in areas involved with Alzheimer's, cognition, areas involved for addiction. And this technology, the key thing has been to develop algorithms that basically focus the energy, and that allows you to now have treatments for Parkinson's where you can stop the tremor or the problems with Parkinson's with high intensity, different settings. Or you can combine it with a microbubble injection and open the blood-brain barrier. That's been a big barrier in neuroscience. It's done with pharma, with shuttle transporters, as well as ultrasound. It opens up immediately. So you can have antibodies or drugs get into the brain with 8 to 10 times more penetration locally. And the third application is neuromodulation. These are all require different doses where you can deliver energy, for example, in the area in the brain, the nucleus accumbens, an area involved in behavior regulation and the reward center, and reset that area to help people with severe addiction. So 3 different applications, and in neurosciences and neurosurgery, this is, I believe, one of the transformative areas because it's non-invasive. It's a 1-hour outpatient procedure. And basically, there's no surgery involved. So that changes the game in terms of being able to deliver therapeutics using ultrasound. And it's not ultrasound, it's focused ultrasound. There are 24 companies out there developing it, from anywhere from 100 ultrasound probes to 1,000 different settings. And you can have different intensities and different doses to improve the function of the nervous system in disease.
Great. Kaf, tell us, I mentioned you want to rewire the brain. So tell us, how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so huge honor and pleasure to be here. I am a neuroscientist and engineer, and so I am extremely fascinated with engineered systems, the brain being the most beautiful of the engineered systems. So over 200 billion cells in the brain, over half of them can basically create electrical pulses, and much of what we do, how we experience life, is based on those electrical pulses. And so my goal is to understand how those electrical pulses organize themselves in terms of producing emotions, both in the case where we have normal emotional interactions and in the case of illness. And as my parents like to say, because I refused to get a job, I also went to medical school for 4 years and did residency in psychiatry as well. And so part of how my thinking is influenced with trying to understand the brain is understanding what is practical and what is scalable. So if any of us was to have chest pain, you might go in an emergency room, and they would put leads on your chest, likely 12 leads, and record electrical information from those 12 leads on your chest. And it turns out it's because the heart is made up of cells which produce and conduct electricity. But somehow we figured out, from a practical sense, we don't need to understand what every individual heart cell is doing to have a way of diagnosing disease. So the work we do in my lab is to figure out what is the pattern across those 100 billions of cells that you might be able to get with 12 leads or 16 leads or 20 leads. And can we use things like machine learning to find the patterns in there such that we can say, this is the signature that you see in a state like depression or a state like autism, so that we can ultimately come up with treatments and cures. And I'll talk more about what those treatments and cures might look like.
Just one quick question. When you mentioned this concept of being scalable, how does that play out?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is, if we need to understand what 200 billion cells are doing in each individual person, you sort of never can compress the information down enough to say, you have this illness, you have this intervention, right? So much of what we do is extracting information and stories out of really complex systems. The best example of this is if you look at a TV has a lot of pixels, but we extract information out of those pixels. And if every other pixel is missing, you just have a lower definition TV, but you still extract the same image. So how low resolution can we get that image? Because the lower resolution we can get, the more quickly we can intervene and develop a treatment off of it.
All right, I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Robbie, so regenerating brain cells used to be considered impossible. That changed during your career, I would say. So talk a little bit about that concept, how it changed, and how you're approaching actually regenerating brain cells.
So thank you, John. And so I lead the Center for Innovation in Brain Science, as John mentioned, and I had the great opportunity to design the Center for Innovation in Brain Science, and I really sat down and asked, what would it take for me to pull up stakes and move back to my alma mater from Los Angeles? 21st century, not a single cure for a single neurodegenerative disease. Now, many great minds have actually tried to achieve that goal. And I thought, well, all I need is one. And so part of what we did was to set up a center that enabled discovery to translation to clinical trials. So how did I come to this regenerative path? Well, let's turn back the clock, 1988. I was young. And I had been working on a molecule, allopregnanolone. Now, let me ask the audience, how many women in the audience have given birth? So during the third trimester of pregnancy, you make the highest concentration of this molecule called allopregnanolone, or ALLO for short. And I was trying to understand the mechanisms of allo action, treated nerve cells in a petri dish, put it in the incubator, overnight, and came back the next morning, and there were more nerve cells in the petri dish. Palm to the forehead, how does this happen? And that has been a decades-long journey from discovery to translation, and now a phase 2 clinical trial of allopregnanolone in persons with Alzheimer's disease. And we just finished up an open-label trial of allopregnanolone in Parkinson's disease. And I'll tell you more about that story. Hang tight.
All right, we will come back to that. I have so many questions I could ask all three of the panelists here, but I thought it would be perhaps more interesting if I gave them a chance to ask each other questions. You've each presented very different approaches here, so what do you have to ask each other?
So something I brought up earlier in our conversation, and that John mentioned, is that I really began my journey in Alzheimer's disease asking the question, why are women at greater risk for developing Alzheimer's disease? And that has been a decades-long journey. But what I discovered is that it's not because women live longer than men by average of 4.5 years. It's because the disease can start earlier. And it starts in midlife, during the menopause. It can start in midlife during the menopausal transition. Transition states. I am fixated on transition states. And so we think about aging, for example, as this linear process. You start out alive and you end up dead. But instead, what happens is you're here, and then you have a transition, and then you plateau, and you have another transition, and another transition. And so part of what, when we think about therapeutics, we typically start at this point and hope that one therapeutic is going to get us back to health. And so what I would ask my colleagues is, do you see transition states in depressive disorder or addiction?
Kath, you want to start?
Yeah, certainly there are transition states, right? I mean, in how you're sort of laying out the life course and starting off with life and going to death. I feel more alive now than I did 10 years ago. So, but certainly, I mean, even in the case, as you mentioned, with women being more sort of likely to get Alzheimer's, it's certainly the case with young women when it comes to anxiety, when it comes to depression, happens earlier in life, and there can certainly be transitions throughout the course of life where the disease shows up more. Illnesses like depression, bipolar disorder, are not constant. They have periods where they're more present and periods where they're less present as well. So certainly, I think it's better to think of these illnesses as transition states, as the course of development, not necessarily only occurring in the first year or two of life, but development occurring across the lifespan.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think a key area is neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's, frontotemporal degeneration, or Parkinson's. For 15 to 20 years, your brain is degenerating, yet you're not aware of it. And after it reaches a tipping point of degeneration, then the symptoms manifest. So one of the key areas is to use biomarkers to detect the disease earlier and change lifestyles, participate in clinical trials and others. So I think a big element is detecting it decades, these conditions, before they are manifesting clinically. The other area is people that have addiction, and Dr. Volkow is the pioneer in this, who's here sitting in the audience. A lot of the problems happens with stress and trauma in childhood, during teenage years, and the brain fundamentally changes over time. So addiction is also a transitional state in terms of starts with the stress and trauma, and the brain keeps on shifting and shifting. So there's a neurobiological basis for many of these things. So there's phase shifts that are occurring with external inputs, behavioral, lifestyle, trauma, genetics, and everything else. So detecting it earlier, treating people early in their teenage years, which is always the nexus that results in these behavioral conditions, is critical.
Puberty being a key transition state.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and the brain is very vulnerable in those days.
Would these transition states also include, people talk about windows of development, like early in life and times of synaptic pruning and things. Are those all transition states?
So certainly early neural development is a transition state. It's interesting. I didn't start out thinking I would be studying aging, right? But that is a transition state. Some people age very well, and some people are vulnerable, right? And comes back to depression, for example, is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, right? These neuropsychiatric disorders are a risk factor, suggesting that there are common drivers of these neuropsychiatric neuro diseases. So it's interesting, we look at early development. It's interesting that for autism can emerge at 2 years of age, 2 or 3 years of age, during this neural development, right? Puberty, depression, risk of addictive disorder, and in the case of aging, and in this midlife aging in the female, risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. It's interesting. I don't know the transition state for Parkinson's. Now, it's interesting that obviously men have greater risk of developing Parkinson's and ALS, women greater risk of developing Alzheimer's. We do know that andropause can emerge as a risk, particularly for men who are receiving prostate cancer therapy. And we can talk about that more later. But that's in pharmacologically induced andropause. And it is associated with an increased risk of developing Alzheimer's. But, other transition states. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think perhaps the optimal way to think about the body and our health is to think of us as constantly being in a transition state, right? Certainly our cancer doctors will appreciate this. We constantly are losing cells and making new cells. And when that transition sort of is not regulated appropriately, that's when we have cells that stay around too long, and you have cancer, right? So our body is constantly changing and shaping itself. Every time we learn something, we have a new experience, our brain is sort of changing and shaping itself, and it's in a transition state. And so I think once we have that sort of framework, what we're looking to do in a health context is shape change, or shape the transitions.
And Kath, since you got the mic, what would you like to ask your colleagues here?
It's a good question. For me, I'm really struggling with this question of how do we get science to matter at scale, right? So not simply answering questions that are relevant in the lab, but answering questions or asking and answering questions in a way that will really change the trajectory of illness at scale.
That's the engineer side of you talking. You want to accomplish something you can see.
At scale.
So I don't know if this is at scale or not. But I think it goes back to a point that we were discussing earlier, where if you are going to tackle the human condition in whatever way, you're going to need multiple domains of intelligence and multiple domains of, if you will, strategies to approach a problem. And you need to develop those social skills of interacting, of being a collaborator. The days of the lone scientist, back at the microscope when I was starting out, change as you go forward if you're interested in actually reaching human beings. There's too much intelligence required. There's just too much intelligence, different types of intelligence that are needed to actually execute. That's why, Dan is in the audience, I think. Eli Lilly, right, is a huge company, right? And so they have enormous difference of intelligences available that we don't typically have in the university setting. However, I think increasingly, there are bridges being built and collaborative teams being built.
Dr. Rezai, you talked in your work with ultrasound about scaling and about how to apply to large populations. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think the scaling problem is really important. Look at the field of brain-computer interface. Billions of dollars spent, so many companies involved, yet less than 150 people have had BCI technology. That's not acceptable. 20 years of science published in Nature, major journals, but the translation has not happened. So I think the key thing is collaboration with engineers, scientists, working with pharma, medtech, the group here in this audience, the collective community that's here. We need to really work together as a community to accelerate the scale because many conditions can get better. I think that ultrasound is a disruptive scaling approach because it's not surgical. As a neurosurgeon, I should be out of a job because ultrasound does not require you to cut the skin and put a hole in the skull, put a pacemaker that we've been doing for 25 years, etc., but allows you to basically non-invasively, with a 1-hour outpatient procedure, stop a tremor in somebody who's got Parkinson's. That's routine. We've been doing it for 10 years. And now research is showing opportunities where you can open the blood-brain barrier. And perhaps in conjunction with biomarkers, you can sample the biomarkers in the brain that normally don't get across the blood-brain barrier. So it's one of those disruptive technologies that non-invasively opens the blood-brain barrier. So now biomarkers of disease can come into the bloodstream, be assayed, and it can deliver therapeutics. Imagine if it can deliver chemotherapy to around the brain with 10-fold the concentration. This still needs to be determined, but that's the research. And I think the neuromodulation is the simplest element that we're trying to standardize the dosing and the standards for ultrasound energy. And that can really change dysregulated networks. Many studies are being done for people with severe anxiety disorders, depression, clinical trial, and we've been working in people with severe addiction, and the results are encouraging. We need to do much more studies, but they're encouraging in that a 20-minute ultrasound energy directed to the nucleus accumbens, the reward center of the brain, can result in an immediate reduction in cravings on the table that can be sustained. So it's a powerful technology that needs to be further studied and standardized, and I think in the future this will have a big role for treating many conditions as a scaling factor.
You know, I started in one of these, my PhD in one of these brain-computer interface labs over 20 years ago.
You worked with Miguel Nicolelis.
Yeah, with Miguel Nicolelis. And what he was doing at the time was he was figuring out how to read information, little pulses of information from the part of the brain that encoded movement. And so he figured out how to feed that information into a computer, fed it into a robotic arm, and at the time, a monkey could essentially move a robotic arm just by thinking about it. You see these technologies now sort of translated into humans. And my idea at the time was, well, if we can figure out how to do this with movement, maybe we can figure out how to do this with emotions, right? So we can essentially have an EKG of emotions, and then we can have like a pacemaker of emotions as well. And as time went along and I got clinical training in psychiatry, one of the things I came to appreciate that the greatest burden of illness worldwide is psychiatric disorders, right? Things like depression and bipolar disorder and addiction. And when I started looking at these technologies, and as he mentioned, you know, they sort of require surgical implantation, they require best technology. There just isn't that much technology for that much illness in the world, right? It just isn't going to meet the need and the demand. So as an engineer, it meant we sort of had to think about things in a very different way. And I became challenged in really deep ways as I was going through my training. I started learning about, you know, childhood disorders, things like autism and other things that you experience. And I would have conversations about technology and engineering and how to come up with treatments and cures. And I found that at some point in time, I was like, the best treatment is probably good child care and early life education, right? It's these simple things that, as a neuroscientist, I never thought that would be my answer. And so as I look and I think about the course of life and how we're trying to come up with treatments and cures, I think it's got to start from a place that says there's a lot of illness, right? There's a lot of addiction. And if we can't start with treating it in a non-invasive way, we're not going to sort of deal with the burden of addiction. And there's a lot of Alzheimer's. And if we can't start to think about how to deal with it in a non-invasive way, it's just never going to scale. Not in the wealthy communities in the United States, not in the rural communities, and certainly not worldwide as well.
And before we go on, I want to make sure Dr. Rezai had a chance to ask his colleagues questions. I realize that we had passed over that.
No, in terms of scaling or just accelerating.
No. Do you are there things you want to know from Kaf or
I
Robbie?
think the question I always ask is that how do we accelerate? You know, we do rapid cycle innovation because tremendous science, tremendous brain power in this audience, but leveraging it and rapidly curing diseases. Or, you know, we got together to come up with the COVID vaccine. Why not do the same thing for Alzheimer's or do it for addiction or other areas? So my question is, how do we do it? How do we scale? How do we get groups together and tangible outcomes, get NIH, get industry, engineering, pharma, medtech, and everybody else together? We talk in these meetings, it's excellent, but what happens afterwards? And come back next year, we talk about it, what happens afterwards? So here's my question to you and the audience. How do we accelerate?
Robbie, you want to start?
Yeah, so that was a conversation, you know, Dan and I were involved in this morning, you know, and thinking about, you know, the current landscape that we're in from the NIH funding perspective. Is this an opportunity to innovate? Is this an opportunity to now close the gaps between the laboratories and the university that are ready to translate and big pharma, small pharma, biotech, to now integrate across those domains? I was part of an engineering research center at USC at the time, and you know, there were engineers who had never talked to a neuroscientist and, you know, who had never thought about cells before. And it's possible, even with engineers.
even with engineers. Okay, we put that out there.
Just teasing. But essentially, I think we're at this inflection point. It wasn't one that we were counting on, but it has arrived. And how do we take this opportunity to build, to think differently, to look at the broader context of discovery and translation and therapeutic interventions, whether they're, through a device or through a therapeutic, a molecular therapeutic. We have this opportunity, and I'm hoping that we get past the stress and move to what's the opportunity in front of us.
Yeah.
And I think, just one thing, I think Aspen Health and the people that are gathered here are the innovators in this space. I think if it comes from Aspen Health, that has an incredible validation, but it's also innovators. Everyone in this room is not here because you're not excited about the future or want to know about the future. This is a great opportunity to harness that innovative, collective energy.
Yeah, I'm gonna piggyback on that and push it a little bit further, right? Because certainly I think there's a lot of incredible collective wisdom here, but it isn't lost on me hearing as you're talking about the work that you're doing on figuring out how to treat addiction. That you're in West Virginia, right? And so you're sort of situated in where, if we look across the country, it's sort of the epicenter of the overdose and opioid epidemic. And I think there's a great lesson in that. And I think we all have to approach that lesson with great humility, right? As we sort of ask our population how they think about the job that we're doing and how we're connecting with them. I'm sure we're at a place where half the population sort of doesn't trust us, or they don't think we communicate very well. Right? And so as we're talking about collective wisdom and insights, I think the big take-home and the thing we really need to do is figure out how to connect deeply with the communities around us, right? Being a psychiatrist taught me so many lessons that neuroscience and engineering didn't offer me about what would work and what didn't work. And my questions about scalability always came from like parents or my own family members who were like, what are you doing that's not going to help me, right? And so I think part of what we need to do as scientists, and I'm challenging myself as well, is to connect with the world around us. And that just doesn't mean the world in our academic medical centers. Sometimes it means the world, 20 miles away in rural areas or 100 miles away. And I think when we do that and we listen and we build teams that include the community of which we're a part, I think we'll come up with much better, impactful solutions.
That leads nicely into a question I did want to ask all of you, and that is, it gets to why you do what you do. And Dr. Rezai, I'm especially interested because you've worked at a number of places, but you chose West Virginia. So explain why you ended up there.
Yeah, so you go to where the need is, and there's need everywhere in the country and the world, but especially in West Virginia, in the heart of Appalachia, these rural states, there is a big problem with addiction, ground zero for addiction, that are devastating communities, starts at early ages, and these are young individuals that their lives are impacted for the next 30 to 40 years. There's a lot of obesity, treatments of obesity, it's a very highly aging population, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. So I went there to help build a team that accelerates innovation. And fundamentally, it's about the need and human suffering. You see individuals that have Alzheimer's who were very high-functioning people. Within a few years, they're a shell of what they used to be. And it's really tough to watch families deal with the loved ones who got Alzheimer's, or how addiction devastates families in multiple units. So we really need to focus on the need, in my opinion, and the science. If you have a science and the need and technology, then magic can happen in a right ecosystem and environment. So I went there because of the opportunity to create new ecosystems and tackle these big public health problems in Appalachia and rural America.
And so when you talk about something like using focused ultrasound for treatment of substance use disorder, you're talking about something that the local community badly needs, as well as sort of the latest technological innovation.
Exactly. And I think the ultrasound, if research continuing, we got to do more research. It's early on. But I think it's non-invasive, so the treatments for addiction, medication does work, and behavioral therapy, but not good enough. So if we can now have an ultrasound technology that can reset the brain and allow somebody to not have cravings, then the community can be engaged and the behavioral therapists can work together. So essentially, you can open a window of plasticity in the brain, because the brain is always trying to heal. That plasticity is restorative. So the ultrasound allows for plasticity, and the community can now get around them and help them. Some of the addiction patients we did procedures on, they go outside after treatment, they're out in the streets again. So you need to have that community support around them. And I think in Appalachia is a big problem. They don't have that community support. The infrastructure is really difficult, so the job is even harder.
Robbie, how about you? Why do you do what you do?
So thanks for asking that question. And I still remember exactly when it happened. I was a postdoc at Rockefeller, and I had the opportunity to be a blind basic science observer on an open label, or a trial, didn't know it was open label at the time, a trial of in women with Alzheimer's disease. And I would spend time with one of those participants and walking along the long esplanade of the Rockefeller campus, and she would regale me with stories of Jung and Adler and Freud and their controversies. And one evening, I took her back to her hospital room, and I bid her goodnight. I closed the door, and I waited 30 seconds. I knocked on the door, and I asked, "Dr. Ansbacher, do you remember me?" And she was so lovely. She said, "I'm so sorry. Should I?" That one woman with Alzheimer's disease transformed the life of this one neuroscientist. So that's how I started my journey, and trying to understand. I figured that if we understood why women are at greater risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, over 60% of persons with Alzheimer's disease are women. If we understood why women are developing Alzheimer's disease, we'd at least have, some degree of success. And actually, it has taught us a lot about what to ask about the male brain. And coming back to a point that both of you have made, is that the brain can repair. And I was shocked that allopregnanolone, I come back to allo, that during the third trimester of pregnancy, when allo is highest, the brain undergoes a 4-fold increase in size. Now, every woman in this room has done the most challenging safety test there is. Allo is safe in women of reproductive age with fetus. And what we've found is that both the Alzheimer's brain and the Parkinson's brain can regenerate. What has been quite surprising to me, both of that, what was quite surprising to me is the rapidity at which the brain could regenerate. The FDA allowed us to treat, in our first clinical trial in Alzheimer's, allowed us to treat persons with Alzheimer's disease for 3 months, the third trimester. And during the during that 3 months, right, the brain actually showed evidence, MRI-based evidence of regeneration. And surprising to me, the Parkinson's brain was even more responsive. Now, we'll have to go on to a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, but it was, again, brain imaging-based. So the take-home message, I think, in part, is disease is not forever. We actually have a fighting chance.
Kaf, you want to talk about why you took the unusual career path that you did?
So I would love to tell you that it's something like altruism and creativity and it's passion. But the truth is that it's selfishness and fear. My mom is one of 5 siblings, and 4 or 5 of them carry a diagnosis of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or schizoaffective disorder. And so it is selfishness for my family, and it is fear what could happen to the next generation of my family. In starting off my career, my goal was to come up with the next best treatment, the next best medication. And it was when a family member who does really well on medication stopped taking it and spent nights on the subways in DC that I realized what medication noncompliance was. And so I thought more deeply about the need to come up with cures. It was after we came up with our first sort of electrical map in the brain and our brain stimulation approach, our prototype. And I was really excited to share it with a family member who has bipolar disorder. And my family, most of my family lives in Ghana in West Africa. And that family member asked me about how this brain stimulation closed-loop pacemaker device was going to get to the third world. And I had no answer whatsoever, because it was the first time I was confronted with the idea that everything I'd been working on out of selfishness to help my family actually wasn't scalable to get to my family. And so that's when the real transformation happened for me in my career. I started thinking about scalability. And it harkened back to this sort of observation in medical school. I always like using this idea of the heart, because the heart has sort of nerve cells that send information over long range and chemicals just like the brain. But in the heart, the cells can also send electrical information directly from one cell to the next cell through a set of proteins. And so I pivoted the lab entirely. We started studying these proteins that allow electricity to move from one cell directly to the next. And we came up with an approach that we thought could actually be scaled in the long run because it's based on proteins. And so the idea is we can just directly rewire the brain by taking these electrical connections, they're called electrical synapses or gap junctions, and wiring and expressing those proteins in the brain to rewire the brain for the long term, such that you don't need to take medication. It just sort of edits the problem out of the brain circuits. And so that's what we're working on now. But this is all out of selfishness and fear that we take on this work.
At the same time, it's a selfishness that could extend way beyond the United States, because you're talking about a type of treatment that is, as you say, scalable.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, we think about this a lot, right? And it's not just beyond the United States. Again, I spent a lot of time in Baltimore, right? And you can go block to block in Baltimore, and the health outcomes are very distinct and very different. So I always think a lot about how do we do things in the research lab that can have the greatest impact on health outcomes, right? If you want to change life expectancy in the United States, as we heard on the last panel, Governor Sununu said this, you go to the rural areas, right? And you figure out how to help with folks in the rural areas, because that dramatically changes the outcomes that we're seeing. So we're always thinking about this in the lab. I'm always challenging people to think in this way in the lab. And we always realize that the work we do in the lab and our research team isn't just in the boundaries of our lab at Duke University. It has to have the influence and the input of the patients we're trying to serve and the community at large.
Did you want to add something, Dr.
No,
Prasad?
I was going to add a comment about the plasticity. The brain is a very dynamic organ, so it's always adapting and adjusting. So this concept of plasticity is very active the younger you are, but throughout your lifetime, even in your 90s, the brain is plastic. And the brain is always trying to normalize. It's always trying to get to an equilibrium state, but the disease pushes it out. So if we can nudge it along with some of these behavioral therapies, medications, or neuromodulation, then you can push it more into a better neuroplastic state, which is a recovery or restorative state. So rehabilitation, whatever it may be, medications, talk therapy, physical therapy, it's allowing the brain to change. So it's really a fascinating part, the plasticity, and the brain is always seeking to normalize. That's important in all diseases. So it needs to go to a homeostasis. That's what's seeking always in every disease.
All right, I really want to leave time for questions, but I want the panelists to answer one more thing, and that is looking forward really quickly. Just each of you, what makes you optimistic about the future? Dr. Rezai, let's start with you.
Yeah, I'm very optimistic because of the advances in neuroscience. It's really an amazing time to be a neuroscientist, and that's a global community of neuroscientists, neurologists, neurosurgeons, psychiatrists, and others. We are finding things like never before. So the advances are going to lead us to better understanding, better diagnosis, and then coupling it with pharma, med tech, and engineering, we can come up with new solutions. So I'm very excited about the potential so we can tackle some of these big problems that we could not tackle in the neurosciences. So great times coming up.
Kath, you're the most optimistic person I know. So
yeah, no, I'm extremely optimistic, and for me, it's sort of centered on the fact that we now recognize that mental illness is real, and that it's linked to an organ, right? You can think back to times where folks wouldn't talk about these things, and there was incredible stigma, and the stigma can do even more damage than the illness itself. So I'm really optimistic that we're at a time where we can now talk about these things openly and explore developing treatments and solutions in a way where we have the broader community as partners.
Robbie?
I'm optimistic because I think science is opening, right? I think there's more engagement between the scientific world and those we serve. Scientists are citizen scientists, right? We're in the service of. And from a technological perspective, we have incredible advances. Ali mentioned biomarkers. That's been transformative. And so I think we're on this this very accelerated pace where therapeutics in writ large have the potential of reaching people sooner. And that's what I'm very excited about. And the other part that I'm very excited about is the integration of data science into health science, and how we can leverage that to actually move therapeutic development, writ large, is for precision therapeutics, precision medicine. We are at the edge. It's no longer a dream. We're closing in.
And just to give a little context to that, we're in an era, when you talk about fast change now, we're talking about coming out of an era where, it was 30 years between the first antidepressant SSRI and the next innovative drug, right? We're talking about a time when the first brain-computer interface was tested and proved 20-some years ago, and only now we're finally getting to FDA-type clinical trials. So when you talk about accelerating, you're talking about not having another 30 years go by.
Exactly. I think the time is now, and I think the technology is there. I think the resources could be there, NIH. And I think the scientific community is different now. The scientific community, the postdocs and graduate students that are in my lab want to make a difference. They want to make a difference. And the culture has changed, the technology has changed. I think we're all going to be in an enormous revolution of therapeutic options for neurodegenerative diseases.
All right, so now everybody's got a question. There are people with microphones, and I will sort of watch so raise your hand. Somebody with a mic will come to you. People with the mics, tell me when you've arrived at some place. Let's start here.
Hi, Laurie Tisch. So you were at Duke, and I'm wondering if you worked with my friend Henry Friedman at the Preston Robert Tisch Brain Tumor Center.
I know him well, yes.
I'm sure you did, which we established when my father had glioblastoma about 20 years ago. And Duke, like many other places, doing a terrific job, but there doesn't seem to be much progress in glioblastoma and I'm just wondering if you can speak on that and if something's coming down the pike.
Yeah, so she's sort of talking, she's mentioning a brain illness in which a tumor, which could be very catastrophic for individuals. So for me, as I think about brain illnesses and where brain is going, I'd be remiss if I didn't sort of mention the magnificent leaps that we've made recently. In 2013, there was an initiative launched throughout multiple federal institutes, the NIH being one of them, which is called the Brain Initiative. And it's called Brain 2025, and the goal was to understand the human brain by 2025. This was a huge, lofty effort. And one of the major projects that they invested in was in the same way that the human genome sort of unlocked our ability to understand different types of cancer and other things going on in the body. They wanted to understand what was sort of the genetic code, the genetic patterns of these 200 billion cells in the human brain, which seems like an incredibly lofty task. It required developing new technology, new ways of storing information, transferring information, bringing in machine learning to find patterns. And it's only in the last 6 months that they released the first versions of these codes for different genomic signatures of different brain cell types. And what that will ultimately, my belief is what that will ultimately allow us to do is target different cell types in health and disease. So you can imagine combining technologies where you can now get drugs across the blood-brain barrier and getting them to certain cell types, ones that may be healthy, but ones may be unhealthy. That's probably what the next generation of treatments will look like, especially for things like glioblastoma.
Other questions in the back there.
So I'm interested in how traumatic brain injury and each of your technologies, each of your responses deals with repetitive brain injury for sports or any kind of traumatic brain injury. Thanks.
Who wants to take that?
Well, I'll start out, and traumatic brain injury, has its own, profile of challenges, and it doesn't end there, right? Traumatic brain injury is a risk for Alzheimer's, for Parkinson's, ALS. And what's challenging about traumatic brain injury is how distinctive all of this is. A blast traumatic injury is not the same as a car crash, right? Or a sports-related injury. So I think, I'm not the person to speak knowledgeably about this, except to say that I think there are efforts across the country that are really trying to tackle how can we recover, how can the brain recover, how can we promote recovery of the brain. But I'm hoping so.
But I mean, suffice to say that if you can grow new neurons, that would help with any manner of brain damage, right?
Yes, so, and I think it's an important question. Right? So part of the challenge, what the technologies that Kaf and Ali have been describing are not neuron specific, they're brain specific, right? So all of these cells are being impacted by these interventions. In the case of aloe is a single molecule, but it has multiple targets. And I think that's an important point because, yes, we're regenerating neural stem cells in the brain, but we're reducing inflammation and we're promoting energy production in the brain. So I think to your point, and I know that these technologies also address, is we're going to need a multifaceted approach. It's not one cell and it's not one area of the brain, right? So, and I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen such benefit in these complex diseases of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's is because it's a multi-target molecule.
Dr. Rasai?
And for brain injury, you got to look at the networks, groups of neurons, as you were saying. So you have cognitive, motor, anxiety, behavioral, different networks. So there's a lot of work being done in modulating this with magnetic stimulation and neuromodulation. And there's also a lot of work being done with opening the blood-brain barrier for people with chronic traumatic encephalopathy and detecting tau biomarkers earlier on. So it's really changing a lot in terms of earlier detection with imaging and biomarkers for multiple traumas, and also neuromodulation that's linked to behavioral therapy to facilitate plasticity. So we need to get ahead of it earlier on and facilitate plasticity. There's a lot that can be done, in our opinion, for
And of course,
brain injury.
TBI itself alters the blood-brain barrier, so understanding that is important, right?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, I think it's important to avoid thinking about any of these things independently, right? It's sort of not your treatment, not your treatment, your treatment. It'll likely be the integration of these things. I think what we're really coming to understand is that your immune system shapes your brain, right? So it turns out you have immune cells that shape the way brain cells talk to each other. And your brain can shape your immune system, right? Anybody who's done meditation absolutely knows that your brain state can shape your immune system. So these things are interacting together. And in the case of something like traumatic brain injury, both of these are coming together. You're sort of like impacting your immune system and your nervous system and the integration between the two of those. So I think the best way to sort of think about where the hope is going forward is how you're going to bring together opening the blood-brain barrier, getting the medication in there, and rewiring a certain set of brain cells as well.
Okay, other questions? Let's go over here. Well said.
Thank you. This was amazing. I have a question. I have two daughters, one in medicine and the other neuroscience. And I'm curious your thoughts as you're approaching like this cutting edge with the current landscape and the reduction of research funding and all that. Where are you seeing? I'm hoping you're still optimistic.
Who wants to take
So
that?
I will start with this. And, a couple of us on the stage are young enough to have gone through many different administrations. And this is episodic, right? It's probably unique, but I see this as an episode. I see that there are some opportunities to hit the reset button and to take a closer look. And other opportunities to say, this is working, let's stick with it. So I think it's early. Am I optimistic? I'm hopeful.
I'll say I'm strategic. So I'm one of those who I have trainees. I've had 6 grants canceled for trainees thus far. And so part of the reason, as I talk about science and what we're doing, and I say it's important for us to communicate more broadly with the public, is because I'm very strategic. And I believe part of our important mission as we're doing this work is to help the American public understand why this work is important and understand why training doctors and scientists is important. Because that's how ultimately we'll be able to get the systems working in ways that increase our ability to produce better science and treatments and cures down the line. So I'm neither optimistic or pessimistic. I'm strategic, and I think that this is the moment where we should be activating people more broadly to make the case about why these things are important.
And Cap, were you swept up in the word search for DEI stuff in grants?
I suspect a word search wasn't necessary, right? So I speak very clearly about how our job, I have a background in I was an athlete, and so I believe our job is to get the most talented people working on the hardest problems. And one might interpret that as meaning DEI. What it really means is we have a job as a nation to find the best talent everywhere, irrespective of what barriers there are, and get them working on the problems. And I don't say that, again, out of altruism. I say that out of desperation, like I want to help my family. And so if you grew up in a rural area, if you grew up in inner city XYZ, if you grew up on a farm, you have ideas. I need your ideas, and removing those barriers means me figuring out how to get you on the playing field.
I call it the all brains on deck moment.
Absolutely.
Ali, funding?
Yeah, so I think founding, so you're right, it's a challenging time, but our funding, we've had very generous donors and foundations who want to accelerate translational research, first in human proof of concept. So that without the support of the foundations and also the institutions, home institutions investing, and the donors, we could not do a lot of these discoveries. So that's critical, and it needs to be linked to a rapid cycle translational research. Take the findings from basic science, quickly deployed safely in patients. That's critical because people with Alzheimer's and people with dementias don't have time. You got to jump on this, so you got to do it now.
Okay, we're almost out of time, but I'll take one more question. How about from way back there?
Hello, everyone. So I actually work in AI for drug discovery and generally do a lot of engineering work and also scientific research on machine learning. So my question is slightly at the top level. Like, I did hear that you expect quite a bit of innovation coming from machine learning, AI, in the relation to healthcare. So what is that one wish that you have for us, AI researchers in healthcare, that we did more often, that would help us get out from the cycle of being long on promise and short on delivery? So what is your wish list for essentially AI researchers who want to change the world every time they wake up, but go to bed not really having achieved much?
Well, that's an easy question. Kat, go ahead.
Super easy. I would encourage you to increase variability in your data sets such that they are more representative and generalized to help the American population.
I would say precision medicine. I mean, and so much of what we need in this kind of therapeutic space is precision. And now, I know the question is just in type 2 diabetes, right? There are multiple type 2 diabetes therapies, but which one is best for that individual? And so we have large data sets, but that doesn't drill down into that individual. So how do we leap from, kind of large data sets to that individual? I think that's a real challenge, but it's critical.
Ali, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yes, break down the silos and be part of teams that are making discoveries and doing translational research. Reach out to them because they can benefit from you. It's a collective team experience that allows us to advance. Without that, we can't move forward.
All right, we have run out of time, but thank you all for coming. It's been a great audience.
Thank you.